Hello students, and welcome to this session in which we'll be doing a detailed analysis of the Maharashtra MBA CET 2026 Slot 2, which was conducted on 6th April 2026 from 2 p.m. to 4:30 p.m. Our analysis is based upon the feedback received from the students who attempted the exam in this slot. Let us start by first discussing the pattern of the paper in this slot. The Maharashtra MBA CET paper pattern was declared well before the exam, and in this slot the paper pattern was exactly as declared. There were no changes in the paper pattern at all. The total number of questions in the exam was 200 and the questions were distributed across 4 sections. The total time available to attempt the questions was 150 minutes. That is 2 hours and 30 minutes. All the 200 questions were multiple choice questions, MCQs, with each question having 5 options, out of which exactly 1 option was correct and that was to be chosen. Each question carried 1 mark, so the maximum marks in the exam was also 200. There was no negative marking. So if the question is answered incorrectly by a student, the student gets 0 marks for that question. There is no negative marks. The order in which the sections were present on the exam is as you see on the screen. The first section was the logical reasoning section. It had 75 questions worth 75 marks. These were question numbers 1 to 75 in the exam. The second section was abstract reasoning. It had 25 questions worth 25 marks. These were question numbers 76 to 100 on the exam. The third section was quantitative aptitude and data interpretation. That section had 50 questions worth 50 marks. These were question numbers 101 to 150 on the exam. And the final section was verbal ability and reading comprehension, which again had 50 questions worth 50 marks. These were question numbers 151 to 200 on the exam. Now, the sections were presented on the exam in this order, but students were free to choose the order in which they attempt the sections. Okay? On the CET exam, there are no sectional time limits and no sectional cutoffs in terms of mark requirements. Students are free to choose the order in which they attempt the questions. All 200 questions are available for the entire duration of 150 minutes. Students are free to jump and skip to any question number that they desire and attempt. Okay? So, as we have seen, the total duration of the exam is 150 minutes, that is 2 hours and 30 minutes. There are 5 options for each question, out of which exactly 1 option is correct and that was to be chosen. Students can switch between the sections and there was no negative marking. Now, how switching between sections was to be accomplished, let's look at that. So imagine this is the screen that you see during the exam. It was divided into 3 parts. So, in the leftmost part, data for a particular question was presented. So, for example, if it's a reading comprehension question, then the passage would be visible over here. Or for a data interpretation question, the graph would be visible over here. The questions were presented over here at the bottom. So, along with the data, this part was divided into 2 parts further. So, the corresponding question was presented here. Then in the second part of the screen, the middle part of the screen, options were given. There were 5 options for each question. And the rightmost part of the screen is where the switching between sections and questions was possible. So there was a drop-down menu in which the 4 sections were present in that drop-down menu. So students can select any of these sections in that drop-down menu and the corresponding question numbers will get displayed in the panel over here. So for example, if the student wants to attempt quantitative aptitude section, so then the student will select quantitative aptitude in this drop down menu, and question numbers 101 to 150 are quantitative aptitude. So all those numbers will be visible here, and the student can then select whichever question that student wants to attempt. And this way student can jump and skip to any of the questions that they wanted. Now this rightmost panel could be closed. So if the student wants to close the question panel, then it was possible to do so, but that did not expand the data and the questions part of the screen. Only the options panel got expanded. So when the questions panel, this question numbers panel, the rightmost was closed, the middle panel got expanded where the options were given. Okay. Now, many students reported problem in terms of the visibility of the data on the screen, especially for questions where a lot of data is present. So for example, reading comprehensions or abstract reasoning where figures are to be looked at in this part of the screen, in the data part of the screen, or data interpretation. So students reported problem with that. There was a zoom button available, but that zoom button only had the plus option. Okay, so there were multiple levels to the zoom button. So you can expand this the size of the data that is present in this panel. The panel itself stayed of the same size. The data inside could be zoomed. But this plus button means what? You can only go in forward direction in terms of the zooming. So you enlarge something. If you wanted it to be even larger, then you click that plus button again. If you want it to be further larger, you click it again. And this way you can zoom in. But there was no zoom out option. There was no reduction of size option available. So if you want to go back to the original size, you have to go through all the options that you keep on clicking plus 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 till you reach the highest level of zoom, and then you again, when you click it again, that plus button, then you go back to the original zoom level. So if you zoom into a data for one particular question, that same zoom level carried forward to the next question, which may not be suitable for that particular question. So some other question, next question that you see, especially for abstract reasoning, you might need all the data visible together on the screen. So then you will have to zoom out again, and for that you have to again click the plus button multiple times to go back to that original zoom level. So that is where students reported problem in visibility. The questions also sometimes for RCs or for data interpretation, the space present over here for the questions part was also limited. So you might be able to see the data properly, but the questions were not visible. So little bit of adjustments needed to be done from question to question in terms of the zoom level. So that is one thing that students from further slots need to be careful about. This is something that you may need to do. So be aware that there is a zoom button available. Also, there was a timer available on the screen from the start to the end. So that timer continuously kept on counting down how many minutes are remaining. Okay. Now that timer also gave warnings to the students in terms of how many minutes are remaining. So when 2 hours were remaining, or when 1 hour was remaining, there was a flashing warning that was shown by that timer. Okay. Now let us look at the difficulty level of these sections as reported by the students who attempted the exam in slot 2. So this was the general difficulty level reported by students for the section. Now in every section there were some questions that were extremely easy, some questions that were easy, some moderate, some difficult. There were very few questions that can be classified as very difficult, almost none. Okay. In general, the questions were on the easy to moderate level for the entire paper. If I want to classify the difficulty level, it was easy to moderate. Section-wise classification for logical reasoning in general is easy to moderate. So for the entire set of 75 questions of logical reasoning, the overall difficulty level is easy to moderate. Same way for abstract reasoning questions, the overall difficulty level was easy to moderate. In those 25 questions of abstract reasoning, There were some challenging questions present. But in general, for the entire set of 25 questions, the difficulty level is easy to moderate. Quantitative aptitude was moderate in terms of difficulty when you consider all 50 questions together. There were some easy questions present, but there were also some slightly lengthy calculation type, more difficult to understand and interpret type of questions that were present, and hence the difficulty of the entire section goes up to moderate level. Verbal ability and reading comprehension section, again the difficulty level in general easy to moderate. Okay, so let us now discuss each of these sections in detail one by one, starting with the logical reasoning section. Now, on some CET papers last year, it was observed that there were quant questions asked in logical reasoning section. But in this slot 2 of 2026, there were no such quant questions at all. All questions in this section were proper logical reasoning questions only. Okay. Now, the breakup of the logical reasoning questions in terms of the main areas is as shown on the screen. There were 4 analytical puzzle questions. Each of them were individual questions. There was no set of questions. In the entire logical reasoning section, there was not a single set of questions. All 75 questions were separate individual questions. So analytical puzzles, there were 4 such puzzles present, but all 4 were single questions. And in general, the puzzles were of moderate difficulty. One puzzle or 2 of them could be classified as easy, but in general the 4 questions put together, moderate difficulty. Out of the logical reasoning section, these would be questions that you don't attempt initially at least. Analytical reasoning had the remaining 71 questions. There were no questions asked from verbal or critical reasoning at all in slot 2's logical reasoning section. These 71 questions of analytical reasoning again were in general easy to moderate difficulty. There were few questions over here in this 71 that the student should have avoided, but rest of the questions are something that students would have been very comfortable to attempt. Let us now discuss the detailed breakup of these puzzles and analytical reasoning question types. So, in the analytical puzzles, there were total 4 questions as we discussed earlier. And out of those 4 questions, 3 of them were based on linear arrangements. There was one linear arrangement in which there was 6 persons sitting in a row, another one in which there were 5 persons, and a third one in which there were 8 persons. But all linear arrangements were with all the persons facing the same direction. So, there were no double row arrangements, there were no arrangements where some people are facing north, others are facing south. No such type of puzzles were present. All 3 puzzles, all the persons were facing the same direction. The conditions given in the puzzles were also not very difficult to understand. So these would be classified as easy to moderate level puzzles. One puzzle was based on comparisons. There were 5 persons and their ages were to be compared. So question was about who is the youngest, who is the eldest, something like that was asked. Okay, so 5 persons, ages to be compared. There were no questions of circular arrangement, box and floor arrangements, distributions, quant-based reasoning or games and tournaments in this section, slot of Maharashtra CET. Okay, so those were the distribution of the puzzles in this slot. Now let us focus on the analytical reasoning part. 71 questions were of analytical reasoning. Now in those 70 questions, 2 question models dominated: the miscellaneous questions and series questions. So out of 71 questions, 20 questions were of miscellaneous question types and 10 questions were of series type. So let us go from top to bottom, discussing each type one by one. So in series type, there were 10 questions. Now series questions were made up of number series, word-based series. There was one question in which numbers and letters both were present in the series. Okay, so 10 questions of numbers, letters, words-based series. Majority of these questions were very easy to crack. Some questions took little bit of time to understand. There were some series questions where alternate numbers were linked. So those were the questions where students might have taken some time to crack. Otherwise, majority of these 10 questions were easy to answer. No, there was no question that was very difficult as such. The difficulty went from easy to moderate. Then there were questions of analogies. So analogies were either 4 object analogies. There was a relationship between two things that are given. It was 2 numbers, and then you have to find out using the same relationship what will come in place of this question mark. This third number also is given, and you have to link and decide what will come in place of that fourth question, that question mark. So 4 figure or 4 number analogies, but there were also analogies with 6 numbers. So there were 2 groups related to each other given, and you have to identify what will be the third group which has the same relation. Okay, so there were also 6 number analogies that were present. Analogies in terms of letters, words were also present. So there are 5 questions of analogies present in this section. There were odd man out questions, again based on numbers, letters, words, 5 questions. These analogies and odd man out questions were very fast to do. So maybe out of those 10 questions, 1 or 2 could be classified as difficult. But in terms of the time taken to solve, they were not that very time intensive. So these 10 questions could be done very, very quickly. There were 3 questions asked on symbols and notations. So those questions were about replacement of mathematical symbols with some other symbols. So plus means minus, minus means division. So those kind of questions. So there was a expression given, and you have to replace the symbols and evaluate the expression. Those kind of questions were present in symbols and notations. This slot did not have questions where you have to link alphabets. So you will be given something like this: A is greater than or equal to B, B is less than C. So those kind of questions were not present in this slot. The symbols and notation questions were all in terms of replacement of mathematical symbols. 5 questions were asked on coding and decoding. Coding, decoding, couple of questions were challenging. Some were straightforward, but there were a couple of questions that had difficult logic to be figured out. Then blood relations, 5 questions were asked. Blood relation questions were all straightforward questions. There were no questions in terms of symbols. So sometimes they give blood relation questions in terms of symbols. A plus B means A is the father of B. Those kind of questions. Those were not asked. They were all the regular blood relation questions where relationships were described. You had to make a diagram and answer the question. The questions were short. They were not very lengthy. Usually the questions were just 1 or 2 sentences. Direction sense, 5 questions were asked. There were questions in which persons were taking turns in the clockwise and the anti-clockwise direction. Angles like 45 degree, 135 degrees were used for take turns. So the turns were not always 90 degrees. There were some questions in which turns were happening at angles of 135 and 45 degrees. So students had to be careful about these direction sense questions. They were not lengthy or difficult, but this is something that some students may not have seen before. So angles like 45, 135 were present in terms of the turns that were taken. The main speed breaker in this section was input-output. 5 individual questions of input-output were asked. Okay, each of them based on a different set of input-output. Each question was separate. So you had to go through the sample input, through all the steps, decide what was actually happening in that particular machine, and then apply those steps on some given input and answer the question. So students would be well advised to avoid doing these questions during the initial phases of this section. These are the questions that you should be attempting at the end if time permits. So most of the students gave the feedback that these questions were to be skipped during the exam. So those input-output questions were the speed breakers in this particular section. There were no questions asked on clocks, no questions asked on calendars. There were 5 questions based on Venn diagrams. Out of those 5 questions, there were a couple of questions in which the Venn diagram was given to the students and the questions were to be answered based on that given Venn diagram, and a couple of questions in which the Venn diagram was to be drawn by the students. There was data given and based on that data, the Venn diagram was to be drawn and question to be answered. There were also questions where 3 set Venn diagram was to be drawn, 3 circle Venn diagram, this kind of a diagram was to be made to answer the question. Okay. There were only 2 questions based on deductions in this particular slot. The 2 deductions questions both had 2 given statements and 2 conclusions to be checked. So 2 statements given, 2 conclusions to be checked in both the questions. There was only one single question of data sufficiency in the logical reasoning section. Now that one data sufficiency question had 3 statements given. Okay, so even though it was not a difficult question, but it will be slightly time consuming. So this would be another question that would take a little bit of time to solve. 3 statements were to be analyzed to answer the question. Then the main area in analytical reasoning, miscellaneous questions. 20 questions were of this area. Now this miscellaneous question types will include large number of question varieties. So there were questions where students had to put words in logical order. So words were given and you have to put them in logical order. So for example, if I give you the words centimeter, meter, miles, kilometer, and so on. So if you want to put them in logical order, what will you do? Will you put it either from the smallest unit of measurement to largest or largest to smallest? So depending upon the options, you have to decide how it is to be done. Either put it from minimum to maximum or maximum to minimum. Terms like silver jubilee, golden jubilee, century, all those terms were given and then you have to put it in order. So those kind of questions were present in those 20 miscellaneous questions, putting things in logical order. There were some questions based on dictionary ordering. So words had to be put in dictionary order and then question based on that dictionary order was to be answered. Then there were many questions in which a word or a number is given. Then you have to perform the steps that were given. So for example, there is some word given and then the steps that were given were all the vowels are replaced with the previous letter, all the consonants are replaced with the next letter, and so on. So after performing the steps, then the question would ask which letter is in this particular position, or after putting all the letters in alphabetical order in a particular word, how many letters remain in the same position. In a particular number, if you put all the digits in the increasing order, how many digits remain in the same position. So those kind of questions were there. There were questions based upon counting. There was a sequence of alphabets, digits, number, symbols given, and then which element is third to the right or fourth to the left, and those kind of questions where you have to count in a sequence. Excuse me. So all those question models were present in this miscellaneous question types. Then there were no questions of cubes or dice that were present in this analytical reasoning section. So this was the breakup of the 71 questions of analytical reasoning. Okay. As we discussed before, there were no questions asked on verbal and critical reasoning in this slot. Slot 2, 0 questions of verbal or critical reasoning were asked. Okay. Next. The second section was abstract reasoning. Now, before we discuss abstract reasoning, just as a quick summary, let me tell you the ideal number of attempts that should have been made in the logical reasoning section. So, logical reasoning section, the students should have ideally targeted 55 to 60 questions done genuinely, and the remaining questions should be then just taken a guess at, maybe eliminate some options if possible, and take an educated guess if time permits, otherwise just randomly guess since there is no negative marking. So genuine attempts I'm talking about are 55 to 60 questions to be done in roughly around 60 minutes. Students who are aiming for extremely high percentiles would have probably gone beyond 60, maybe 60 to 65 questions in 60 minutes. Now the second section, that is abstract reasoning section. So this section had total 25 questions. Now this is the breakup of the 25 questions in abstract reasoning. There were 5 questions based on completing the series. There were some series with 4 figures given and you have to find the 5th figure. There were some series with 5 figures given and you have to find 6th figure. So 5 questions of completing the series. 9 questions of 4 figure analogies. So 4 figure analogies means there will be 2 figures that will be given, and whatever relationship is there between the first 2 figures, you have to find what option should be replaced, which should replace the question mark, so that the same relationship exists between the third and the fourth figure. So out of the third and fourth, one of them would be missing, and you have to decide from the options what will come in place of the question mark. So those are 4 figure analogy questions, and those dominated the abstract reasoning section. There were no odd man out questions in this slot. There were 3 questions of water image. So a figure was given, and from among the options you had to decide which option is the correct water image of the given figure. There was one question in which a cube was given in a opened up form. So in this format, the 6 faces of the cube were opened up like this. And you have to identify what is opposite a given particular face. So there was a question asked, opposite to that particular face is which face? So there was only one question of that type. There were 6 questions based on counting of polygons. So counting of triangles, rectangles, squares. So there were figures given, and how many triangles are present in that figure, how many rectangles, how many squares, those kind of questions were asked, 6 of them. These questions were the speed breakers in this section. So out of the 25 questions, these 6 questions are the ones that students should have been careful about. Out of 6, there were maybe couple of questions that were very easy to count. The remaining would have been time consuming. There were some questions in which the number of those polygons was very high and would have taken a good chunk of time to count it. So those are the questions that should have been avoided in the initial phases. So those are the questions that students should take educated guesses at or count later as time permits after doing everything else. There was one question based on how many lines are required to draw that given particular figure. Okay, so there was a figure given, and the question asked was, what is the number of lines that are required to draw that figure? Which was not very difficult to count. So this was moderate difficulty. The difficult questions in this section were the counting the polygon questions. Okay, so now a good number of attempts in this section would be around 20 attempts to be done in 17 to 18 minutes. So I am talking about again genuine attempts, 20 questions or so. The remaining should be guessed at by making some elimination of options, or if there is no time, then just randomly guess and mark all the answers. So genuine attempts should be 17 to 18 minutes ideally. Okay, so that is abstract reasoning breakup. Next, let us discuss the quantitative aptitude. So that is quant and data interpretation section. So this section had total 50 questions, out of which 40 questions were of quantitative ability and 10 questions were of data interpretation. There were 0 data sufficiency questions in this slot, in the quant section. There was 1 data sufficiency question in the logical reasoning section, but 0 in the quant section. So let us look at the breakup of the quantitative ability 40 questions in this slot. So the breakup was 4 questions were of simple equations. Again, these questions are of easy to moderate difficulty. Couple of them were easy, couple of them were slightly more difficult to frame the equation. The solving part was not very difficult. It was the framing of the equations part that was difficult for a couple of questions. So those that made it moderate in terms of difficulty. There were no questions asked on special equations. So special equations means what? The question models where there are less number of equations and more number of variables. So those kind of questions were not present. There was 1 question based on ratios. So from the topic ratio proportion variation, 1 question was asked which was based on ratios. There were 2 questions asked from percentages. Both were pretty straightforward. The ratio question also was of moderate difficulty. 3 questions of profit and loss. Those 3 questions again classified as easy to moderate. 2 questions based on partnerships, out of which 1 was easy, 1 was slightly more challenging. It had a person investing for 6 months, another person for something like it was not for an entire year. There were 3 persons investing. So that question was slightly more challenging for the students. 1 was pretty easy. There were 3 questions based on simple and compound interest. 1 question, especially that was difficult in this section, had ideas of simple as well as compound interest present in it. Those students who were conceptually very strong in terms of percentages and interest concepts would be able to solve it pretty easily. But otherwise, in general, it can be considered as a slightly difficult question out of those 3. Time and work had 5 questions. And out of those 5 questions, there were a couple of questions that were similar to each other. So if you were able to solve one, you will be able to also solve the other. The questions were based on the same idea. So time and work, 5 questions were asked, varying in difficulty from easy to moderate. Time and distance, 5 questions were asked. Here again, there were a couple of questions that were based on the same concept. So if you are able to solve one, you will also get the other. There were questions where there are 2 trains starting at 2 different places and they are meeting and then they are crossing each other. So one question in terms of time taken to meet, another in terms of after meeting, if the time is given, what is the ratio of their speeds. So those will be difficult questions that can be those can be considered in general to be difficult. There was a question based upon, in fact 2 questions based on races which were of moderate difficulty. There was 1 question based on average which was again moderate. 1 mixtures and allegation question which can be considered as a little bit difficult. Okay, so you can see a good number of questions were asked from the arithmetic area in this particular slot, as is normal for Maharashtra CET. There were also 4 questions based on simplifications. So direct calculations had to be performed. There were numbers given in with decimal points present. You had to divide a number with point present in it by another number present with a decimal point in it and find the result. So those kind of things. So simplifications were asked. There were numbers based 3 questions, numbers basics based 3 questions based on idea of LCM, HCF, or questions like how many numbers, how many 3-digit numbers are there whose first digit and last digit is 2. How many numbers of this form? The first digit is 2, last digit is 2. So how many such 3-digit numbers are there? So those kind of questions were asked. Numbers advanced had 0 questions. So numbers advanced is finding last digits or finding remainders. Those kind of questions were not present in this slot. Number series was present on the logical reasoning section, not in the quant section. There were no number series questions in the quant section. Sometimes on the Maharashtra CET, series is asked in both logical reasoning as well as quant. But here in this slot, no number series questions. Geometry questions were absent. There was no pure geometry based questions, but there were mensuration based questions. 3 questions were asked based on measurements. The mensuration questions focused on rectangle areas and Pythagoras theorem. So students who had that knowledge of rectangle area or rectangle perimeter, that concept also was tested, perimeter of rectangle, area of rectangle, and a knowledge of Pythagoras theorem would be able to solve these questions easily. There was one question asked on permutations and combinations, which was a difficult question. There was a word given which had multiple vowels present, some multiple consonants present, and question was regarding how many arrangements can be formed in which all vowels are together. 2 questions based on probability. Both those questions are moderate to difficult questions. So considering all the questions together, the arithmetic, geometry, PC, probability together, the overall difficulty level of the quant section can be considered to be moderate. It was not easy overall. Some questions definitely were on the easier side, but overall it goes to moderate level of difficulty. Algebra questions were not present. Sequence and series based on identities or indices and sorts, or heights and distances questions, trigonometry based, or 30, 60, 90 triangles based. Those kind of questions were not present in this slot. Data sufficiency, as we discussed, was absent in this slot. There were 10 questions of data interpretation divided into 2 sets of 5 questions each. There was one set based on pie chart and the other based on bar graphs. Both the sets, the data that was given was very easy to understand, nothing complicated in terms of the data given. But questions, some of them were slightly tricky, little bit of advanced knowledge regarding percentages and angles based pie charts was required to be able to solve them efficiently. Those who had practiced these kind of questions before would have found those questions not very difficult to manage, but otherwise they would have seemed to be tricky. So overall, the 10 questions put together can be classified as of moderate difficulty or slightly on the higher difficulty side for students who have not practiced calculation based DI thoroughly. But those who are well versed with percentage concepts would have been able to do this easily. The pie chart was given in terms of angles. So calculations had to be thought of and done in terms of 360, and bar chart was given in terms of percentage. Okay. So in general, for the quant section, the difficulty being moderate, ideal number of attempts would have been around 35 to 40. In approximately 50 minutes. Students who are strong in quant, have prepared this section thoroughly, would have been able to attempt maybe even slightly more than 40 questions in 50 minutes. But for most students, this would be the ideal range of attempts, the genuine attempts in the quant section. Now let's look at the final section, that is verbal ability and reading comprehension. So the breakup of questions in verbal ability and reading comprehension is, as you can see on the screen, 14 questions were from vocabulary area, 11 grammar based questions were asked, 5 verbal ability questions, and 20 questions of reading comprehension. Okay, so let us go through these in detail. The vocabulary questions, which were 14 in number, were subdivided into these 5 question types. So synonyms means what? Same meaning words. So these were very fast to attempt. So in terms of time taken, there it will be hardly few seconds that will be required to attempt it. The words that were given to identify the same meaning words were not very difficult, and the options also made it pretty easy to identify which is the synonym. There were very few questions of synonyms and antonyms where options were very close. Options were not that very difficult to distinguish between which is the correct synonym or antonym for these vocab based questions. So overall can be classified as easy for both synonyms and antonyms. There were 2 antonyms based questions. Antonyms means opposite meaning words. There were 3 questions based on identifying the meaning of that particular idiom. So there was an idiom given and the meaning of that was to be identified. Again, the questions asked over here were all pretty straightforward. Idioms that were given were commonly used idioms in day-to-day life. So most students would be able to quickly identify, and those questions also took very less time to attempt. This identify the words or group of words that were incorrect or to be replaced. This was actually one whole paragraph given. So this 5 questions was one paragraph in which there were 5 words that were given in bold, and you had to identify those words or group of words one by one, whether they are correct or whether they need to be replaced by some other word. So for each of those bold words in the paragraph, there was one question asked with 5 options given, and you have to decide whether the word that was highlighted was correctly placed in the paragraph, or was it appropriately used in the paragraph, or it was to be replaced by one of the options. And there was one question in which we had to identify the wrong or incorrect word. There were 4 words given in bold in a single sentence. So there was one sentence that was given with 4 words in bold, and you have to identify which words were wrong or incorrect out of those 4. So that was one such question. So that was the breakup of the 14 questions in vocabulary part of the VARC section. Grammar, there were total 11 questions. So there were 5 questions in terms of identifying which of the sentences that were given was correct. So there were 5 sentences given in each of the questions. There were 5 such questions, and in each question the 5 options were 5 sentences which were trying to say the same thing, but you have to decide which out of those 5 is grammatically correct. Then there were 3 questions based on phrase replacement. So there was a phrase that was highlighted in a sentence, and we had to decide whether it was appropriate or it needs to be replaced by one of the given options. Then one question based upon identifying grammatically correct bold part, and 2 questions based upon figure of speech. So in a sentence, a particular word was highlighted, it was given in bold, and you have to identify what figure of speech that word is. Okay, so 11 such questions based on grammar. There were 5 questions based on verbal ability. All those 5 questions were para-jumble questions. So there were 6 sentences given. They were labeled A, B, C, D, E, F, and you had to put them in the correct order. And questions were asking which sentence is the second one, which should be the 4th one, and so on. Now, those 5 para-jumbles, 2 of them were based on the same set of 6 sentences. Similarly, another 2 were based on again same set of 6 sentences, and there was one question which was based on another set of 6 sentences. So actually, in terms of the set of sentences that you have to decode, there were only 3 such sets. 2 questions based on one set of 6 sentences, another 2 questions based on another one set of 6 sentences, and the last one question based on another one set of 6 sentences. Okay, so those were para-jumble question types. And the final question model in this VARC section is reading comprehension. There were 20 questions of reading comprehension. There were 4 passages. Each passage had 5 questions. The passages were not that very lengthy to read. Approximately 200 words or so was the length of the passages on an average. Out of the 4 passages, there was one passage which was a little bit difficult to comprehend. The remaining 3 were easy to understand. The questions themselves were not very difficult. Even in the passage that was difficult to understand, the questions were not that difficult to answer. So overall level of difficulty of reading comprehension can be considered as moderate, whereas the other question models in VARC were easy to moderate. Okay, so considering all the 50 questions together of VARC, the level of this section was easy to moderate, and the ideal number of attempts would be around 40 to 45 questions done genuinely in around 45 minutes. Okay, so this is the detailed analysis of all the sections of slot 2 of Maharashtra MBA CET 2026. Considering all sections together, students should be targeting a total of around 145 to 155 genuine attempts in the paper. Toppers, those who are looking for the best of the best colleges, should be going towards 160 plus attempts, though that will be considered as the score that should be targeted by the students who are targeting the best B schools. But in general, we can say 145 to 155 attempts in this slot would be considered as a good number of attempts. Okay, so with that, I'll be ending this session. Wish you all the very best.